Just 6 years after their flight around the Virginia airfield, something happened far off in Bosnia.
New York Times, June 28, 1914. Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife were shot and killed by a Bosnian student today. The fatal shooting was the result of a political conspiracy.
That violent act led to a war that would change the whole world and affect American life for the rest of the century. It was called the Great War. Later it became known as the First World War. An English politician, Lord Grey, realized how bad it was going to be.
The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime.
The Great War began in Europe. At first, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and Turkey, fought the Allies, England, France, and Russia. It was a struggle for power and land and money. No one believed it would last long, especially in the United States, where President Woodrow Wilson insisted the country not take sides. He remembered the Civil War from his own childhood. He knew how awful the effects of war could be.
The United States must be neutral, in fact as well as in name. There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight.
But World War I was worse than anyone could have imagined. Armies of men dug themselves into trenches and slew men in other trenches. And new inventions, like the Wright brothers airplanes, which were intended to do good, became instruments of death. At first, airplanes were used to scout enemy territory. Flyers leaned out of cockpits and shot their weapons at enemy pilots. Then a new invention allowed pilots to synchronize machine gun fire with propeller blades. Soon bombs were brought aboard and dropped by hand over the plane's side. But perhaps the most deadly weapon of all were German submarines. And on May 8, 1915, Americans were the target.
New York Times. The Cunard liner Lusitania sailed out of New York last Saturday with 1,918 souls aboard. She was sunk by a German submarine which sent 2 torpedoes crashing into her side.
As pressure to enter the war mounted, President Wilson refused until early in 1917, when Germany sank 8 more U.S. ships. On the night of March 31st, Woodrow Wilson got out of bed and took his portable typewriter to the south veranda of the White House. In the quiet of early morning, the president typed out a message that was to become famous.
The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. We are accepting the challenge. The world must be made safe for democracy.
It was a presidential call for a declaration of war, and it made it clear that this was to be a war on behalf of freedom. On April 2nd, President Wilson spoke to Congress.
It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy.
Wilson received the greatest ovation of his life. The congressmen cheered and cheered. The president went back to his office. He looked at his aide. "Isn't it strange that men should cheer for war?" he said. Then he put his head on his desk and wept. At first, the Germans weren't worried by President Wilson's announcement that the United States would join the war effort. They thought it would take years for America to get ready to fight. But they miscalculated the country's resolve when it came to fighting for democracy. President Wilson now requested that the Star-Spangled Banner be played at all military events. It was a time to rally every ounce of patriotism. More than 1 million Americans were drafted into the Army, trained, and sent overseas. One young recruit was Lloyd Staley from Kansas.
My dearest Mary, I write this on board a boat that will leave for overseas soon. I can scarcely realize we are going. Goodbye, little girl, for a time at least.
As American soldiers fought for freedom in Europe, Woodrow Wilson increased national security at home. He supported the Espionage Act of 1917, severely restricting Americans' freedom of speech. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. Under these new laws, more than 1,000 Americans were arrested and convicted.
During World War I, both private and public institutions led a tremendous crackdown on freedom at home. German Americans found themselves persecuted. The speaking of the German language was banned in many places. Also, dissenters, people who opposed American participation in the war, were rounded up, arrested, jailed, many of them deported if they were aliens. This was probably the most severe repression of freedom of speech by the national government in American history, and it seemed contradictory to the idea that we were fighting a war to expand freedom around the world.
By 1918, the fighting in Europe had dragged on for 3.5 years. Almost 9 million Europeans had died in the struggle. Both sides were near collapse, but the American forces now tipped the balance.
My dearest Mary, well, it's been just 4 months since I left the USA, and it's been a pretty long 4 months, too. If the Germans like war, the Yanks are giving them plenty of it. I've seen wounded men, my own soldiers in arms coming back to the hospitals, and, well, it just gets to you, that's all. I'm willing and ready to go to the limit to bring this business to a decisive end.
After more than 112,000 American casualties, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, it suddenly became quiet. The cannons were still. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. A British lieutenant described the war's end this way.
The roar stopped like a motor car hitting a wall. The resulting quiet was uncanny in comparison. We kept the boys under restraint as long as we could. Finally, the strain was too great. A big Yank ran out into no man's land and planted the stars and stripes at the lip of a shell hole. A bugler began playing the Star-Spangled Banner. And they sang. Gee, how they sang.
My dearest Mary, the band is playing the Star-Spangled Banner. We're coming back to the good old USA, and I'm coming back to you. I will tell you about this war when I get back. For there isn't a chance in the world of ever forgetting a single thing.
It was labeled the war to end all wars, and for the first 3 years America sat on the sideline. It was World War I. A decisive reason for America's Declaration of Independence was weariness from involvement in Europe's endless wars. Washington's farewell address warned against such military involvement, and for over 100 years this policy served the nation well. In June 1914, after a Bosnian terrorist assassinated the Archduke of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, setting in motion a domino effect of alliances that ended in the Central Powers of Europe, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, at war with the Allies, France, Britain, and Russia. This would be the last war started by the feudal agreements of the kings and queens of Europe. Within days, Europe was ablaze. In the beginning, President Wilson declared America's complete neutrality. However, internal sentiment polarized around the war's participants. The nation's large German population supported Germany. The predominant English-speaking population backed the Allies, except for the anti-British Irish Americans. In the war's first month, the German army rolled through Belgium and northern France until stopped at the Marne in September. For the next 4 years, the war bogged down in hideous trench warfare. As Europeans slaughtered each other, American business quickly learned to profit from the war, selling goods and supplies to both sides. This meant shipping across the Atlantic Ocean, an activity that would eventually draw the country into the war. Britain blockaded ports of entry for supplies bound for Germany. The Germans employed their novel weapon, the submarine, to sink American merchant ships aiding the Allies. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Titanic's sister ship, the Lusitania, carrying many American women and children. The ship sunk quickly, killing hundreds. The sinking shocked the nation. The U.S. demanded immediate reparations from Germany. When Germany failed to do so, it pushed Wilson towards the side of the Allies. Over the next 2 years, German U-boats continued to sink more American ships, and the United States' position of neutrality deteriorated. In 1916, Wilson campaigned for the presidency on the theme, "He kept us out of war." But privately, he told his advisor, Colonel House, that if some formula for peace between Germany and the Allies did not appear quickly, we must inevitably drift into war with Germany on the submarine issue. In 1917, World War I entered its 3rd year. The combatants were still bogged down in senseless trench warfare, but both sides still foolishly clung to the prospect of victory. For America, the trigger for war came when Germany decided on January 31, 1917, that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. 3 days later, Wilson broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. A month later, a decoded message from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico was given to Wilson. It urged Mexico to declare war on the United States if America entered the war on the side of the Allies. In return, Germany would guarantee the return of the lands Mexico lost in the 1848 Mexican-American War. When the notorious Zimmermann telegraph was released, public outcry demanded war against the Germans. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. In his speech, he said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." For the first time, advocacy of democracy around the world became a reason for the United States to flex its military might. Henceforth, spreading and protecting democracy would become the major justification for American military involvement into the 21st century. War had been raging in Europe for 3 years. During that time, America had remained neutral. But on April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany and enter the fighting on the side of Britain and France. A year and 5 months later, the war would end, but the consequences of the brief engagement would be dramatic for the United States. America mobilized for World War I in a new and powerful way that would be repeated in the wars that would follow in the 20th century. Congress passed the Selective Service Act, establishing local draft boards, and 2 million men were called up for service and shipped overseas. The first training field for warplanes opened in Illinois, and with it began what would, a generation later, become the United States Air Force. In July, the first soldiers arrived on European soil, though the first American shot was not fired until October. The United States fighting men got their first real test in the spring of 1918. Germany, knowing she had to act before all of America's forces were in the field, launched the last great offensive. She pushed back the Allies for 2 months, but lost certain victory when an American division held its ground and the German attack sputtered. More battles followed, and the Americans showed their fierce courage. By the end of the summer, the war was lost for Germany. After 4 years of fixed trench warfare, Germany signed an armistice on November 11, 1918. The war to end all wars was over. In reality, combat would take only a short time out until the next World War. But the conflict served notice that the United States was a preeminent military power when it chose to be one. The cost of the war was relatively light for America: 49,000 killed in battle. Diseases claimed 57,000 more, and another 230,000 wounded. World War I produced its share of heroes. Foremost was General John Blackjack Pershing, commander of the American Army, whose famous remark when he entered Paris in 1917, "Lafayette, we are here," was a fitting tribute to France's help during the Revolutionary War. Aerial combat, the most romantic part of the conflict, provided America another true war hero in the mold of Washington, Grant, and Teddy Roosevelt. He was an ordinary American named Eddie Rickenbacker. The war ended the outmoded European style of trench warfare. Bolstered by chemical weapons, machine guns, and artillery, millions on both sides were slaughtered in foolhardy frontal charges against entrenched positions. In reality, the war was fought on 2 small battlefields, northern France and the Mediterranean. In the end, little had changed except the surrender terms had left Germany destitute, laying the foundation for the next war. On the political side, American participation gave the United States a seat at the peace negotiations in 1918. From here, Wilson set forth his famous 14 points and his idea for a League of Nations. Though the United States formally rejected the League, its founding was significant in that it brought all the nations of the world together in an organization to regulate themselves. Disbanded in the 1930s, it would be resurrected as the United Nations in 1946.